America's top diplomat just sat down inside Beijing, under Chinese government sanctions. That's not a diplomatic dispute. That's a man banned by the country he just flew into, still walking through the doors of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, still shaking hands, still negotiating on behalf of the United States. And what came out of that room could determine whether the world's most strategically important waterway stays closed or open. This is happening right now. Today, Thursday, May 14th, 2026. Beijing, China. President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping sat down for more than 2 hours of talks at the Great Hall of the People, one of the most consequential summits between the two countries in years. And after that meeting ended, Secretary of State Marco Rubio sat down with NBC News for an exclusive interview. What he said carries consequences that stretch from the Persian Gulf to the gas pump near where you're sitting right now. The confirmed headline: the United States and China have agreed that the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage through which roughly 20% of the world's oil flows, should not be militarized. China, according to Rubio, also reiterated its opposition to Iran developing nuclear weapons. These are significant statements, but they come wrapped in contradictions that the official readouts are not explaining. If you want to follow this story as it develops, without noise, without spin, subscribe now, because the next 24 hours could move this in a completely different direction. Let's lay out exactly what we know and what we don't. The Trump-Xi summit had been postponed 6 weeks, specifically because of the Iran war. That single detail tells you everything about the weight of this conflict. An already complicated US-China visit, held against a backdrop of trade friction, Taiwan tensions, and technology competition, got pushed back because the Iran situation was too volatile to risk overshadowing it. The war itself began February 28th, when US and Israeli strikes hit Iran. Since then, Iran has responded by effectively shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point less than 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, bordered by Iran on one side and Oman on the other. Nearly a fifth of global oil passes through there, or it did. Since the blockade, that flow has been severely disrupted. Energy prices have surged. The Trump administration even moved to temporarily suspend the federal gas tax in response to the economic pressure building at home. Into this environment, Trump landed in Beijing, and the question everyone was asking: would he ask Xi Jinping to use China's deep relationship with Tehran to help end the war? According to Rubio, the answer was no. We are not asking for China's help. We don't need their help, Rubio told NBC News. That's a striking line, because in the same breath, Rubio acknowledged that the global oil price surge is not something the US is completely shielded from. We are not immune to global oil prices at some point, he said, noting that other countries around the world are paying a much higher price. So the US doesn't need China's help, but the economic effects of the blockade are real. They're being felt, and Trump himself said just this week he's not even a little bit concerned with the financial pressures Americans are facing during the Iran negotiations. Rubio defended that statement. He framed it as a message to Tehran, not a dismissal of American families. If Iran thinks domestic political pressure can force Trump into accepting a bad deal, that is not going to happen, was the message. Separately, China and the US found agreement, at least in Rubio's telling, on 2 specific points. First, the Strait of Hormuz should not be militarized. Second, there should be no tolling system on ships transiting the waterway. Rubio confirmed China told the US they are not in favor of either. And then there's the nuclear question. According to Rubio, China reiterated its opposition to Iran developing nuclear weapons. This echoes a position Beijing has held publicly for years, but the significance now is the context. With an active war underway, reconfirming that position in direct talks with Washington carries real weight. Or it should. Here's where things get complicated. China's own official readout of the Trump-Xi summit, released through state-run Xinhua news agency, made no direct mention of Iran. None. The readout said the two leaders exchanged views on major international and regional issues, including the Middle East situation. That's it. A passing, vague line. So, on one side, you have America's Secretary of State in a television interview confirming Iran-related agreements. On the other, you have China's official account of the same meeting that doesn't mention Iran by name at all. That gap between what Rubio says happened and what Beijing chose to publicly confirm is not a small detail. China and the US supposedly agreed on Iran, but China's official account of the same summit doesn't mention Iran once. Someone is managing a narrative here, and we don't yet know whose version holds. Here's what makes this particular moment so loaded with consequence. The Strait of Hormuz is not a regional waterway. It is a global artery. Oil from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, it all funnels through that narrow corridor before dispersing to refineries across Asia, Europe, and beyond. Iran's effective blockade, enforced through a combination of naval presence, threat, and regional leverage, has thrown global energy markets into a state of sustained disruption. Countries that import almost all of their oil through that route have been hit hardest. Asian economies, Japan, South Korea, India, have had to scramble for alternative supply routes or accept far higher delivery costs. European nations already managing post-conflict energy challenges now face an additional layer of price pressure. The economic ripple from one narrow body of water is being felt on every inhabited continent. The US itself exports oil and has domestic production, but it is not isolated from global prices. The federal gas tax suspension was a signal. Governments don't suspend revenue-generating measures unless the political pain of high prices is registering at a level that demands action. Against that backdrop, the US-China agreement on Hormuz, if real and if it holds, matters enormously. Not because China controls the strait. They don't. Iran does, in practical terms. But China has significant leverage over Tehran. Beijing has been Iran's largest oil customer for years. China's diplomatic pressure, economic influence, and political relationships in Tehran represent one of the few external forces with genuine persuasive power over Iranian decision-making. Which is why what Rubio said in that NBC News interview deserves more scrutiny than it's getting. If Washington is not asking Beijing for help, but clearly understands that China's influence over Iran is real, then what exactly is the strategic logic? Is the public message of "we don't need their help" a negotiating posture? A signal to domestic audiences? Or is Washington genuinely convinced that its own military and diplomatic levers are sufficient? There's no confirmed answer to that. Tell us what you think is happening here. Is this diplomatic posturing or a genuine strategic disagreement between Washington's stated position and its private calculations? Drop it in the comments. And if you want to follow every development as this moves, subscribe. This story is not slowing down. What's also worth noting is the Taiwan dimension. Xi reportedly warned Trump directly Thursday that tensions over Taiwan could lead to clashes and even conflicts if not managed carefully. That warning, combined with Iran, with Hormuz, and with China's economic weight in the region, It means the Trump-Xi summit was not a single-issue conversation. It was a negotiation across multiple pressure points simultaneously. Rubio's response on Taiwan was measured. U.S. policy has not changed, he said. Our policies on that have not changed. It's been pretty consistent across multiple presidential administrations. He confirmed U.S. arms sales to Taiwan did not feature prominently in Thursday's talks. But Taiwan supporters have been watching Trump closely. In December, the administration announced an $11 billion arms package for Taiwan, described as potentially the largest ever, with an even bigger one possibly in the works. That's not a signal of reduced commitment to the island. But Trump has also spoken about Taiwan in openly transactional terms. And any ambiguity, real or perceived, gives Beijing something to work with. Rubio traveled to Beijing under Chinese government sanctions. Think about that for a moment. China's sanctions on Rubio, imposed in 2020 over his criticism of Beijing's human rights record, were technically still in force when his plane landed. China resolved the contradiction by arguing that the sanctions applied to Rubio's actions as a senator, not as Secretary of State. New title, different legal standing, entry permitted. That explanation is technically convenient, but it also reveals something worth sitting with. If Beijing was willing to bend its own sanctions framework to allow Rubio into the country, they wanted this meeting badly enough to create legal gymnastics to make it happen. Countries don't bend their own punitive frameworks for meetings they don't value. So why exactly did China want Rubio there so much? While diplomats met inside a grand hall in Beijing, the consequences of what they were discussing were already playing out in the daily lives of millions of people. The Strait of Hormuz disruption is not an abstract geopolitical fact. It is a physical blockage on the movement of energy that heats homes, runs factories, moves food across supply chains, and powers hospitals. The shock from that narrow corridor in the Persian Gulf has radiated outward with a consistency that economic systems are not designed to absorb quickly. Think about what a sustained energy price spike actually means in practical terms. For a family in a mid-sized city in Southeast Asia, where fuel subsidies have already been cut in recent years and incomes have not kept pace with inflation, a 20 or 30% increase in energy costs is not manageable through lifestyle adjustments. It means choices about food. It means local businesses that depend on trucking and logistics, cutting staff, or raising prices. It means the quiet, grinding cost of an international conflict arriving at the kitchen table. In countries closer to the Gulf, the psychological layer is even sharper. Communities in the UAE, Oman, Qatar, and Kuwait, countries that sit on or near the most strategically tense geography on Earth right now, have been living with the awareness that a war is active in their region. These are nations with deep economic ties to both the US and China. Their governments have been threading delicate diplomatic paths, trying to avoid being drawn into a direct confrontation while managing the spillover effects on their own infrastructure and populations. The workers who operate the supertankers that normally transit Hormuz several times a month, many of them from South Asia, the Philippines, and other countries dependent on maritime employment, have seen their routes disrupted, their schedules thrown into uncertainty, and in some cases, their vessels rerouted through far longer alternative passages around the Cape of Good Hope. That adds weeks to transit times. It adds cost. It adds risk. And it reveals how many layers of ordinary human economic activity sit beneath what diplomats describe in summit readouts as the Middle East situation. On social media, the reaction to Thursday's summit was immediate and fractured. Some users pointed to the Rubio interview as evidence of a diplomatic breakthrough, proof that the two most powerful countries on Earth were at least speaking in aligned terms about the risks of further escalation. Others noted the silence in Beijing's official readout and read it as a sign that whatever agreement Rubio described was either overstated or still in its earliest, most fragile stages. In Iran, the domestic political reality is its own separate equation. The government in Tehran has framed the Hormuz situation as a legitimate defensive response to what it describes as U.S. and Israeli aggression. Iranian state media has reported Trump and Xi's summit with skepticism, portraying any U.S.-China alignment on Hormuz as an attempt to pressure Tehran rather than resolve the underlying conflict. Whether ordinary Iranians, many of whom have lived under decades of economic sanctions and are now in the middle of an active war, share that framing fully is a harder question to answer. Access to independent reporting inside Iran is severely limited. What is clear is that the people with the least power in this situation, the shipping workers, the fuel-dependent families, the communities in Gulf states watching military activity at closer range than most news cameras ever reach, are bearing costs that the summit communiques do not capture. The agreement on Hormuz, if it holds, would matter to them directly, not as a geopolitical milestone, as the difference between prices stabilizing or continuing to climb, between uncertainty extending or beginning to lift. That's the gap between what happens in a summit hall and what happens to people. Here's the problem. Agreements in summit rooms need to translate into action in the real world. China saying it opposes the militarization of Hormuz is one thing. China using its actual leverage with Tehran to change Iranian behavior at the Strait is something else entirely. Those are two very different things dressed in very similar language. Iran has not made any public statement adjusting its posture at Hormuz following the Trump-Xi meeting. The ceasefire from last month, which Trump credited China with helping broker, has had an uneven track record. And Iran's nuclear calculations, whatever they are privately, are being made under active wartime conditions, not peacetime diplomacy. What happens in the next 72 hours, whether Iran responds publicly to the summit, whether China privately escalates or pulls back its messaging to Tehran, whether U.S. naval posture in the Gulf shifts in any direction, will tell us far more about whether Thursday's meeting produced real movement or a carefully staged alignment of talking points. The next development could be quiet, or it could not be quiet at all. Step back from the immediate news cycle for a moment. What happened in Beijing Thursday was not just a conversation about Iran or Hormuz. It was a test of whether the U.S.-China relationship can function as a stabilizing force in a crisis neither country created, but both now have to manage. The diplomatic architecture of the post-Cold War era assumed, at some level, that major powers would share enough of an interest in global stability to cooperate even when they were competing. That assumption has been under stress for years. Trade wars, technology restrictions, military posturing near Taiwan, sanctions. The US and China have been building walls between their systems, even as their economies remain deeply intertwined. Thursday's summit didn't remove any of those walls. Taiwan policy didn't change. Sanctions on Rubio remain formally in place. The underlying friction over trade and technology was not resolved. What the summit did, at minimum, was establish a channel, a conversation at the highest level, during a moment when active conflict in the Middle East is affecting both countries' economic interests. China is not a neutral party in the Iran situation. Its energy imports from Iran, its political relationship with Tehran, its stated opposition to the U.S.-Israeli military campaign, these are real. But China also has a significant interest in stable global energy markets. Its economy depends on affordable oil. Its Belt and Road infrastructure projects across the Middle East and Central Asia require regional stability to function. A permanently closed or militarized Hormuz is not in Beijing's interest, regardless of its public statements about Iranian sovereignty. That shared interest, economic, not moral, is the foundation of whatever agreement Rubio described Thursday. And shared economic interests are more durable than diplomatic goodwill, which means there's something real to build on. Whether anyone builds on it is a different question. What intelligence agencies on multiple sides are now monitoring closely is the gap between what governments say and what they do. The Hormuz situation has revealed how quickly a regional military conflict can become a global economic event. That lesson is not lost on anyone sitting in a capital city watching oil prices move. What's being watched now? Whether China takes any concrete diplomatic steps toward Tehran following the summit. Whether Iran's posture at the Strait shifts, even incrementally. Whether the ceasefire framework holds or begins to fray. And whether Trump's stated position that he doesn't need China's help is the beginning of a successful unilateral approach or the setup for a much more complicated second act. The Jimmy Lai case, raised by Trump during the summit, adds another dimension. Lai, 78 years old, sentenced to 20 years in prison in Hong Kong on national security charges, has become a symbol of how Beijing handles dissent in territories it controls. Trump's willingness to raise the case publicly and Rubio's statement that Washington would be open to any arrangement that would work for them as long as he's given his freedom, suggests the U.S. is keeping human rights on the table as a lever, even in the middle of a crisis negotiation focused on energy and war. Whether Beijing sees that as principled or as pressure is, again, a question only Beijing can answer. And so far, Beijing's official account of the meeting hasn't answered it. The Strait of Hormuz remains, as of this reporting, under the effective control of Iranian forces. The war that led to its blockade remains active. The ceasefire of last month has not produced a permanent resolution. And two of the world's most powerful countries have just met, agreed on some things, disagreed on others, and released readouts of the same conversation that don't match. That's where we are. That's what's real. And the next move belongs to Tehran. This story is not finished. It is barely past its opening act. The real test of what happened in Beijing today isn't what Rubio said in an interview or what Xinhua's readout chose to include. The test is what Iran does next. What China actually says to Tehran in private. Whether the Hormuz blockade begins to ease or tightens further. We will be covering every development as it comes. Drop your analysis in the comments. Do you think China will actually use its leverage with Iran? Or is this shared public agreement without any private follow-through? And subscribe so you don't miss the moment this situation moves, because when it does, it will move fast.